Afternoon again. When people say the polls were wrong, they're not talking about the private polling that is done for candidates and campaigns. They're talking about public polls that are done by largely by news organizations. And for the second straight election, the perception is that public polls done by media outlets were wrong, were unreliable. I'll never believe those polls again. And the truth, I suspect, is more nuanced, but the cloud, I should say, hovers. So let's try and unpack this with a great panel. And by the way, the last panel was fantastic. We have a high bar here. We have Dan Balz of the Washington Post, their chief correspondent who covers national politics, the presidency, and Congress. Dan's covered every presidential campaign and midterm election since 1978, has been deeply involved in the Post's polling projects. David Chalian is the vice president and political director at CNN, where he leads the network's political unit, including its polling and decision desk operations. And prior to CNN, David worked at Politico, Yahoo, PBS NewsHour, and ABC. Claudia Deane is the vice president of research at the Pew Research Center. Prior to joining Pew, Claudia worked with the Kaiser Family Foundation to research the public views on health policy and spent 8 years as assistant director of polling for the Washington Post. Bill McInturff is part of a bipartisan tandem with Hart Research Associates that has for decades conducted the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll. Bill is also a partner at Public Opinion Strategies and was in 2008 the chief pollster for Senator John McCain in his bid for the presidency. And excuse my barking dog in the background. Thank you all. It's great to see you all. Dan, let me start with you. Why do news organizations do public polling? Why do you invest in that project?
Well, we think there is a value to readers in having our own sort of scientific analysis of where public opinion is in the country, and not just for predictive purposes of campaigns. That's not why we do polling. We've done polling for 30 odd years, a little more than that. One of the reasons that we began to do it was that we felt that there was something that we could add to the public knowledge of the state of the country. Another reason that we have always felt it worth doing is that there are many private polls in campaigns. There are obviously campaign polls. There are tons of special interest polls. And we have always felt that we could bring an independent eye and an unbiased eye to public opinion. And that's why we've done it. We do polling of all types. We've had a long relationship with ABC to do basically a monthly national poll in which we are tracking some very broad trends: state of the presidency, presidential approval, state of the parties, major issues to people. We've done work over the years with the Kaiser Family Foundation that Claudia is quite familiar with, in which we were able to take much deeper dives into specific issues. These had nothing to do with elections per se, and often didn't have anything to do directly with politics, but looked at critical issues to the country. We have experimented with lots of different kinds of polls, both to try to stay abreast of methodology at a time when all polling is challenged. And we have abandoned certain things that we think do not add to the public knowledge or to the understanding of campaigns, and we've tried to delve into other areas. But the basic answer, David, is that we think that there is value in having independent public polling available to our readers and to all readers.
You know, the title of this session is Predictive or Addictive. And it's also true, isn't it, though, that you get a lot of clicks from a poll. There's a lot of interest in it. You know, for all these people who are grousing about polling, they are very attuned to it when it comes out. So are there not sort of more commercial reasons to want to do polling?
Well, there's commercial reasons to much of what we do, and there are sometimes non-commercial reasons to things we do. We don't make those decisions on the basis of the number of clicks we think we're going to get. Obviously, there is great interest in polling, as we have seen, and I think that with the proliferation of public polling, there's even more interest, and it can get confusing, frankly. But yes, a lot of our polls do get a sizable amount of traffic, but there are many other stories that we do about a political campaign that get that much or more traffic. So yes, we're always looking for readers, but that's not a fundamental reason why we think about doing polling or the way we think about the kind of polling we want to do.
David Chalian, I know that you, because we're colleagues, I know that you put an emphasis on things other than the top line horse race number, and you in your reporting, and you encourage in other people's reporting an emphasis on more than the top line. But it is inexorable, isn't it, that people just run to that. That is what draws attention. People pour through the data to get to that number. How do you, what do you hope to get out of polling, other than viewers and attention? What do you hope to get out of polling, and how successful can you be in the hothouse of a presidential campaign in focusing people on something other than the top line?
Right, it's a good question. To Dan's point, obviously, actual election polling is a small portion of our overall polling, because we are polling on all these national issues, how the country is dealing with coronavirus, how all those things is sort of the bulk of our polling in totality. But I know that we're focusing here on election polling, and it is so important, David, to get underneath the horse race. There is no doubt a gravitational pull to the horse race in coverage. And just personally, I find it the least interesting. I mean, to me, understanding what's making the electorate tick, how Americans are sort of sorting themselves as they're thinking through the candidates that are being presented to them, the issues that are driving their decisions, the personality traits or characteristics of the candidates that are most important at that moment. That all to me creates the basis of far more rich storytelling opportunity for us. I mean, we can't simply get into the country with our cameras and correspondence and make sure we're talking to a representative sample at all times. Yes, we do some of those man on the street interviews. We try to get a flavor of a state or a community, but what this sort of scientific approach of a big national poll does for us, it allows us some sense of taking what the candidates are presenting to the people and understanding how the American people are responding to those platforms. And so while the addiction part of what you're saying in the title of this seminar is real, and people are constantly refreshing and seeing and who's up, who's down. And you hear me at CNN all the time because we are colleagues. I do sort of bemoan that driving the coverage too much. And I'll just give this one example and then I'll let you move on. But one of the greatest, most recent examples to me of the fact that it is possible to have the news media cover a campaign without polls is in the Georgia Senate runoffs. We at CNN, at least, I'll speak for myself, although I know Dan, has his standards as well at the Washington Post. We don't report every poll, right? For us to report a poll result, it has to be a poll that meets methodological standards that we deem appropriate for our reporting, in the same way that we vet sources of information before we go to air with a story. We have done all the vetting on the sources that are providing us the information for the story. Well, the same with a poll. Jenna Jester, our polling director, does an in-depth analysis of any poll and has the pollster sort of answer a sort of series of questions to vet the methodology that it meets our standards for reporting. So that's first of all. We try to only put forth what we think is high quality polling to the American people in our storytelling. But Georgia, there was no polling that met our standards for reporting. So we went through an entire campaign, 2 critical Senate runoff races, and we didn't report on a poll once at CNN. And it was great. It was a great story. I mean, we did a ton of fascinating stories of what was going on, what was driving the race, the dynamics that were behind it, but not one poll was driving our coverage. And I use it as an example to remind people that we don't have to rely on horse race polling in order to tell good stories about what's going on in a campaign.
I want to come back to that and the question of how polling might actually influence coverage. I will say, by not having any polls, no one could say CNN got Georgia wrong. That's good. One other question for you, David, and then I want to move on. CNN also had a poll of polls. In other words, an aggregation of polls, much as Real Clear Politics and 538 do. And so you had that, and then you had your own poll. Sometimes those numbers didn't correspond. What kind of message, or what is the message of that? I mean, how awkward was that for you as the maestro of all of this, in terms of explaining which people should pay attention to? Because I'll just say this one thing: the aggregation of the polls ended up landing almost exactly on where the race finished, but the polls themselves varied widely.
They did vary. And of course, when you are averaging polls, I'll go back to my note about sort of vetting polls and using high quality polls, because if you're throwing a lot of garbage polls into the averaging, well, then the average isn't going to mean much either. So what we try to do in the poll of polls is, we are only averaging the public polls that meet our standards for reporting. So there's a lot of polling out there that does not meet our standard. They're not factored into the average. That may be less true for Real Clear Politics or 538's average, which is why you'll see some differential in numbers there. But this is what I believe. I welcome all the polling, because I try, as a consumer of polls, I try to have it sort of all wash over me. I think relying on any single poll, even a CNN poll, which I'll stand by our polls. We are methodologically rigid. Jenna Jesta does amazing work. Our partners at SSRS are excellent in what they do, and it helps us tell stories. There's no doubt. So I have no problem when there's a difference in the average and our horse race, because again, I think the poll is more than just the horse race, A, but B, because I think you should take all this polling into consideration as you are talking about polls. Being reliant on just one poll in one moment of time is just not the best way to consume. And it's, quite frankly, it's really not what polls are intended to do in this space in terms of informing the public.
David, can I just jump in very, very briefly to augment something that David said? One of the things that we have done increasingly when we write up our poll stories is to describe how they fit in the overall context of what other polls are showing. We're not so proprietary that we are unwilling to say our poll shows X and most other polls show Y. And we try to do that in almost every story, particularly if there is something anomalous in ours, even by a handful of points. So it's one thing that we've worked on very hard to be quite transparent on.
Yeah, what you can't control is how your poll gets covered. So you may throw disclaimers and nuances into your story, but the coverage generally is going to be about the top line number. Claudia, you sent me some really interesting notes based on your 25 years of involvement in these polls. Talk about the proliferation of polls and about the sort of market and the market forces that are governing this, the demand and supply that has led to the proliferation of polling, public polling.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to take the view over that quarter century, because the debate we're having right now, we could have had 25 years ago. I'm pretty sure in my late 20s, I first wrote the story that I'm sure everyone on this call has written, which is, gosh, why is everybody so fixated on the horse race? The poll has so much other stuff, right? We all publish that. We still publish it repeatedly. But the demand for that sort of information has just gotten more intense. And over this time period, the supply of these potential actual numbers has also gotten completely overwhelming. You perhaps at one point could have had like a very manageable spreadsheet where you were looking at all the surveys and you could say, is this a random sample? Like there were just even fewer methodologies, right? Now that's not possible. There's so many people doing polling. It's extremely difficult to screen it all. And so I think even as you've seen the polls proliferate, right, because the lowered barriers to entry that the internet brought us, you've also seen the media outlets proliferate. So there's more and more people polling, there's more and more people covering it, and the ability to really sort of have a very strict newsroom policy like the Post does or CNN does about, hey, here's what we cover and here's what we don't, like you say, that's now in a pretty limited spectrum of the media. And so I think all those trends kind of interact in a challenging way.
Let me just ask you this, and then I want to turn to Bill McInturff, who lives in two worlds, one as a pollster for the media and one as a pollster for candidates. But Claudia, what do you think this proliferation has done to the quality of polling? Because not all polls, not all media organizations have the budgets. Tony Fabrizio was pointing this out in the last session. They have the budgets to do the kind of sophisticated calling and sampling that candidates do, and so that I presume adds to some of the unreliability of some of this polling that is part of this miasma that you described.
Well, I think there is clearly a lot more variability in the quality going into each poll, but the other thing that's happened, the other trend over this time period is that polling methodology has like evolved and gone through all these iterations, right? The end of the landline phone, the advent of the cell phone, the advent of the internet. And I mean, I think one positive takeaway is that we've seen polling attack each of these challenges and sort of drag itself over the hill every time. I mean, we're still here. It's hard, but I think it's difficult now to identify what is the one right way to do a poll. I mean, we don't really have that. And so that makes evaluating the incredible plethora of options just more difficult.
Bill, you've lived through all these changes. You have the gray beard to speak to it. Tell me what you confront methodologically. One of the points that was made by the two pollsters in the previous session was that they spend an enormous amount of money in their campaigns making sure that they have the right mix of landlines and cell phones and internet calls and text to internet polling and so on. Tell me how much your approach to this has evolved over time with your public poll, and how much you think that some of the noise in the polling has been caused by methodological problem.
Few things. First, there's one of the major divides with something called random digit dial, where you call any available number within an exchange versus calling from voter list. So campaigns that moved to voter list around the 2008-2012 time period. NBC Wall Street Journal did random digit dialing through 2016. And then as a survey, we've shifted to do voter files. And I'm not sure. I think there'll be more national polls moving to voter files and even fewer random digit dial. So that's one change I think we're going to see. I think there will be more methodology changes in national polling. I think the integration of text to email, e-text and email to web will be part of what's being done by media pollsters. But there's one, I do think I can tell you again, as you said, a step in a foot in each camp. There is one advantage that you definitely get when you're working on the Republican or Democratic side, which is each party has spent a fortune on data analytics. So the data analytics means that across these states, they have voter files. They've matched the voter files to a prediction based on partisan composition of that individual person, sort of a guess is what they think that person would be like, and a guess about that turnout. So in 2020, in each individual state, The campaigns have exactly who's voted and their own data analytics about who they think those people are and how they're going to vote. This is one of the things that allowed the Trump folks to say, this is closer than you imagine in these states. So as news organizations, we're still doing national polling because our job in a news organization is to tell a national story. What that means is a third of the country, the core blue states, were voting for Biden by 20 or 35 points. That's a third of your national sample. You've got a third of the national sample that are core Trump states where he's ahead by 10. And so your swing states are a fragment of the national survey versus the campaigns that are doing and spending money really only in state by state by state polling, where they have the additional analytic advantage. Having said that, I don't think the campaign polls were flawless. I'm just, for example, the President Biden or then Vice President Biden campaign in Iowa and Ohio the last week. Given the margins in those states, I can't imagine that the Democratic polling was showing those states with a 6 to 8 point Trump margin. You wouldn't send your candidate to those states if that's what you thought the state was going to be. So I think the notion that somehow the internal campaigns were flawless and media polling was flawed is a little convenient after the fact.
You mentioned 2016, and I want to ask this question of all of you. There was a lot of soul searching done in 2016 because Trump, particularly in state polls in these battleground states, did far better than people anticipated. That was a function of missed voters in the modeling, and it created a lot of questions about the polling in 2016. It should be noted that most of the national polling was pretty close to what happened in 2016, but the state polls were not. What kind of soul searching did you guys do after 2016 as you were planning for 2020 to try and avoid the same problems? And how successful do you think you were? Bill, why don't you start?
Well, from an NBC Wall Street Journal perspective, we made a whole series of changes. First, we moved from random digit dialing to using voter files, which I think kept us on the mark in 2018. We used to call saying we're calling for Wall Street Journal NBC. We dropped that because we were concerned that despite the increase in incidents, maybe there were people who were not taking the poll because of the media sponsorship. We changed where we put screeners in the front, including party, so that the questionnaire itself would not influence your reaction to the party. We changed weights in terms of how many people we're interviewing in rural America. Fortunately, in 2016, we'd already changed the education weight. So we'd increased the number of high school or less. Thank God we did that before the election. One of the major results of the soul searching by the industry after 2016 was they found that many state polls were overrepresenting college and college graduates, not high school or less. That was one of the recommendations. So having done all those things, we were right in the mark in 2018. But this NBC Wall Street Journal has done 8 cycles. In 7 previous presidential cycles, we were really, really, really close to the final margin. And despite those changes, this time we were not. That brings up a few things. First, there are 2 ways to tell the story. What's the number? And then how our clients wrote the story. If you read how our clients wrote and reported the story the last weekend, they did a very good job of saying, hey, guess what? There's in these swing states, there's a ton of white high school and less people that could easily vote, given what we saw incumbents do in 04 and 12. We talked about the increase in the Latino and African-American men voting for Trump. We talked about the reasons this race was probably far more competitive than the actual number. But lastly, and I don't want to, we can talk more about this. Having said all that, I still think that we need as an industry to wrestle with, is this Trump? Or if indeed after, Trump has spent 4 years attacking polling, attacking mainstream media, is there in fact a chunk of the electorate that is not participating in polling, that in some way, because of their non-participation rates, we are missing. And despite the methodology you use, because of non-participation. And that's a long answer. We'll talk more about what we're looking at and the testing we're doing, because we have a commitment to try to make sure this gets done right.
David, what kind of conversations did you guys have going into 2020 about changes that you needed to make, and how successful you think you guys were?
Well, we had some of those methodological conversations, especially the last thing that Bill was just talking about sort of the non-participating population and making sure that we're capturing as much of a representative sample as we possibly can. But I would say that, and we're doing this all again, reevaluating now as well, and just as Bill said, because there's a real desire to get this right. And I would just say that one of the biggest conversations we had after 2016, though, was on Bill's other point, which is about how these polls are reported, David. So we changed graphically how we present polls after 2016. We no longer use the term leads if it was within the margin of error. If the two numbers were within the margin of error, we put up a big yellow banner on the top of the graphic that said no clear leader in this poll, in this race. That's something we hadn't done before, because this gets back to the talk about so much focus on the margin, which we all know, all of us sitting on this panel, the way the way we talk to campaigns, we reporters, and the way campaigns like Bill and you, David, when you used to do campaign business, like talk to us, it's like, oh, we just got this poll out of the field and we're +2 here, and everyone sort of speaks in this shorthand, and it becomes the way that political professionals speak. But in terms of presenting this to the public, we also wanted to remind everyone in the way we reported this to look at each number of support. That's an important thing to look at, each candidate's support number, irrespective of the margin. So we tried to emphasize that as well, both graphically and in our copy, in the banner that runs along the bottom of the screen. Those were some of the most significant changes we made in terms of how we report the results of these polls. And those changes, I think, helped us tremendously in altering our conversations around these polls on air, the way our digital stories were written and looked at. Since 2016, I think we saw a lot less of just this person has a big lead, or a lot less of that, and a lot more allowing for, as Bill was saying, the NBC rights did, or the Wall Street Journal rights did at the end of the campaign, allowing for closer contests than perhaps the numbers reflect.
Yeah. Although all your organizations had pretty wide leads for double-digit leads, I think, for Biden going in, and was the polls were looked at in that, despite your best efforts, were looked at it in that way. Dan, I want to.
And he won by 7 million votes.
He did. And 4.5% of the vote, of the 4.5%. I mean, part of this is the electorate didn't look like people fully anticipated, and that's Trump's twice now changed the contours of the electorate, and polls are only as good as your modeling, and modeling, is scientific to a point, and then it's a bit of an art. Dan, I got to ask you, because Fabrizio brought it up in the last session, though he was polite enough not to mention the Post. You got one poll, a state poll, and I want to ask why state polls, and Claudia, you may want to chime in on this, why state polls have been notoriously more unreliable than the national polls. But Wisconsin, you guys had a poll late in the campaign that had Biden up 17 points in Wisconsin. He won by less than a point there. When you got that
the margin of error, isn't
it? Yeah, depending on where you set the margin, I guess.
Plus or minus 18.
But
sample of 6.
When you got that poll, did you look at that poll and say, maybe we shouldn't run this poll? Maybe this poll is an outlier because it belied sort of the history of the state and a lot of other things that you had seen?
It's a great question. And I know when we got that poll back, both Scott Clement, who's our polling director, and I, kind of looked at it and were like, oh no. I mean, you just know that Wisconsin's not going to be a 17-point state. And we had a similar issue with a Minnesota poll, not quite that much, and much earlier in the cycle, or in the fall, which also seemed too strong for Biden. And in both those cases, the first thing that's done is that Scott and Gary Langer at ABC go back and try to scrub everything possible in the poll to see if there's any flaw in the way the methodology worked. And there were a couple of things in the Wisconsin poll that popped out. One was that there were more people who said they voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 by a fair amount than there were, and it was a different mix than we had gotten in the September poll that we had done in Wisconsin. As it turned out, our sample in Waukesha County, which is the most important and biggest Republican county in the state, turned out to be a bad sample. I mean, we just got the wrong group there. And so I think, yes, this is one of the, 5 out of 100. That's a bad poll. So the question is, well, what do you do with that? We did not, frankly, seriously think about not publishing it, because I think there's a cost to credibility if you walk away from a bad poll. So the alternative was to try to describe within that poll, and Scott, I think, did a good job, and people can quibble whether we did it high enough in the story or not, but in which we were quite candid, that the poll did not match anything else, and certainly was not close to what the Marquette University Law School poll that Charles Franklin does, which is considered the best in the state, that it was way off from that, and some possible reasons for that. So I think that we offered people a pretty clear warning. Don't take this poll overly seriously, but nonetheless, we're not going to hide from it, because it would have come out that we had a poll in Wisconsin that we didn't publish, and so people can decide whether that was the good call or not a good call. But that was why we did that, David.
David, before you jump to Claudia for 1 second, I just want to add one thing. Dan talked before about the value of public polling by news organizations. One of the words he used was independent, that it's good to have an independent poll out there. The other word I would add to the value of media organizations doing polls is transparency, and exactly this reason of what Dan is talking about right now. We, unlike campaigns, unlike interest groups, we are fully transparent with our methodology. We publish everything we do, and when we get the wacky poll that is the 5 out of 100 or whatever it is, we publish it and try to explain it. And I think that transparency is of great value to the consumption of these polls. So I just wanted to add that.
No, you could, but the challenge, Dan, you say it would be bad for the credibility of your polling and your organization to withhold a poll. It's also tough on because when it's retold, there's not an asterisk next to it unless you read the story and the disclaimer. There's not and that's that's a tough line to walk. I mean, not
it is, David, but I think that frankly this one was so far off that almost everyone discounted it pretty quickly. I mean, I'm not sure very many people took it seriously, frankly, which was the right thing to do.
All right. Okay. Claudia, first of all, what the state polls have been more of a problem than national. And as was pointed out, I think, I don't know who mentioned this, maybe Bill, state polls are really states are how we elect presidents, not the national poll. In fact, there is some question, I don't know how you make these judgments, whether what value national polls are when it comes to horse race anyway. But tell me what you feel the problem has been with state polling, and what to do about it.
Well, I mean, we are going back, whether we mean to or not, to the idea of the horse race. And yes, if you want to figure out the electoral college and who's going to win, you need a state by state poll. You can do a lot with a national poll, looking at geography or different subgroups of people. But if you were going to just focus on that horse race number, yes, you'd want a state by state. You have to think about who's funding polls and how expensive they are. It's more than tens and thousands of dollars. It's hundreds of thousands of dollars when you're getting to a really big sample size survey. And if you think about who's funding them on the national level, it's largely media organizations. What do we know about state media organizations? They are in dire straits right now. There just aren't people out there with the funding. Our shop is somewhat unusual. We're funded by philanthropic funds. If there were a similar desire to do that in all 50 states, then you could have that happen. But basically, the return on investment just isn't there at the state level. And that's why there are many fewer state pollsters with much shorter track records, with the exception of some universities.
Should people should organizations with resources refocus on the states that are going to?
I would love to see that. I think a ton of interesting policy making happens at the state level. Wouldn't you love to have a poll of Texas right now and know what's going on and be able to catalog people's experiences? Yeah, well, text to phone. A lot of our people are doing surveys on their phones.
David,
we did a survey with Dan at the Washington Post, just as an example of other kinds of surveys, and with the Kaiser Family Foundation as well, surveying people after Hurricane Katrina who had evacuated to Texas. And we did that by going into the Astrodome and sort of counting, random samples. So I'm just saying there's lots of different uses for the methodology beyond this.
Go ahead, Bill.
One of the
wait, Dan, let me take Bill.
Go ahead, Bill, sorry.
I apologize. And so I want to look in a political world, in a news organization, let's say, I want to be sympathetic to the Wall Street Journal and ABC. If they had killed that poll in Wisconsin, their own reporters would have said they're killing a poll because it's showing Biden ahead by too much. But I have clients once every year. Some clients will say, Bill, you just told me the margin of error is 95 out of 100. How do you know when it's the 5 out of 100? And it's happened. That's the whole point of any poll. You're going to have a weird result every once in a while. It usually happens when you see it, and I say you know it because the subgroups in the poll don't look normal. And a lot of times when that happened in my career, like McCain in South Carolina, when Bush started pulling ahead in the primary, it's because the electorate is shifting and you're right on top of the shift and they haven't come down to the new point yet. But, and then of course there's a lot of money. But I'm in a different world after 2020, whether it be a news organization, the other option you have to say, look, I just don't feel good about this. Let's go do another 400 tomorrow night, and let's go check this number, and let's see if it's got anything like this. We're going to talk about things we're trying to do at NBC Wall Street Journal better. I don't want to single out a poll, but having gone through 2020 and between 16 and 20, it's not a good time to be a pollster. We're under, legitimately, as we should be, a lot of pressure and a lot of doubt. But as Dan talked about a 2020 decision, I hope a 2022 or 2024, that this experience would lead to a different conversation in every news organization about when we get a poll like this, what are we going to do and how are we going to handle it? And I'm not sure that result would be the same result in terms of releasing that poll. Or any poll. It doesn't have to be that one. But as a pollster, when your own pollster is saying, yikes, this is not making me feel good, that's the point at which you say, we might be in my 5 out of 100. I'm sorry about the money, but we have some obligation to go do a double check on this before it's released.
Yeah, that's a tougher message in news organizations. Stan, I know you wanted to speak, but I want to ask a different question. You are a disciple of David Broder, who was famous for traveling the country and knocking on doors and going into shopping centers and taverns and so on and talking to people and got a real texture for what was going on in the country. I know you personally had panels of voters who online were filling out diaries so that you could get a sense of what was going on in their lives and their thinking. Does polling in some way pervert coverage? Do we get too reliant on polling? And do we take it too seriously rather than going out and doing the kind of reporting that people like David and frankly you made famous?
Yes, I just want to make one point prior to this, which was one of the changes we made after 2016 was to de-emphasize some national polling. We stopped doing tracking poll in the final 2 weeks on a national basis and shifted resources into state polling as a way to fill that gap. It wasn't entirely successful, but that was one of the changes we made. That's a great question. And because 2020 was in the COVID year, there was no opportunity to do the kind of thing that David pioneered.
Yeah.
You could not go out and knock on doors and talk to people. I have had done it for years and have done it for years. And it's not a check on polling, but it adds to a level of understanding of the state of the electorate. I don't think I ever went out on one of those projects and where you would spend, 3, 4, 5 days in a particular community, which, a community that was carefully selected because it was probably a swing area. And I never did one of those without coming back, having learned things that were, if not, they weren't necessarily contradictory to the poll, but they often informed the kind of questions that we wanted to ask in a poll. Claudia remembers this. And you could not do that in 2020. And frankly, for a lot of reporters, it was a great frustration. But I think also the proliferation of polls has caused that kind of reporting to be de-emphasized. That it is easier, frankly, for everybody, for all of us, to simply grab at the polls or grab at the poll average and not bring in what voters are really thinking. And that's something that we will have to struggle with even when we're out of the pandemic.
Yeah. David, you help supervise coverage and face some of the same barriers this year, but do polls make us lazy?
I mean, I don't think so. I think it's a different element to our coverage. I mean, it may make some people lazy, I guess, but nothing substitutes going to talk to voters and being in a community the way Dan just described. CNN's been doing polling forever. We've also been going out and sending correspondence to a community and spending some time there and talking to voters and hearing what's on their minds and hearing them in their own words talk about what the candidates are presenting as the options before them. I don't think you can have complete coverage of a campaign without both. I wouldn't want to be without either one of those elements. You certainly can't rely on just the anecdotal, and you should not just rely on survey research. I just think it's the combination of the two, as well as all the other textured reporting that comes into it, that makes for the whole of a campaign reporting exercise.
Claudia, before we go to questions, what evidence is there that polling influences voter behavior? In other words, a front runner kind of voting, or voters who drop out of the electorate because of polling. There were a lot of complaints in 2016 that the presumption was that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and therefore voters who were tepid on her didn't participate, who voted for third-party candidates. Do polls influence voters' decisions?
Well, there's some empirical evidence for that, but it's experimental. After the 2016 election, a former colleague of mine, Solomon Messing, and a couple of his academic colleagues did some experimental research, in particular showing people's probabilities of victory, which was another sort of, switch in the way we were reporting margins, and found that it could potentially demotivate people, but we'd love to have more empirical evidence. If there are any UChicago PhD students out there, we'd love to see some more real world studies on this.
It does raise a question. David was noting the freedom that came with the lack of polling in covering the Georgia race. And there are plenty of countries, I think more than 90, that ban polls in a certain period before the election. And it does raise the question as to whether or not there should be some sort of limitation to when polls could be published. There are all kinds of issues associated with that. I can't even let you comment on it because we've got all these people who want to ask you guys questions. John Austin from JAA, I'd be interested in any insights the panel has on what Fox saw in Arizona on election night that others did not. Mr. Chalian, could you address that specific to CNN?
Well, I can't address what Fox saw because I was not part of their decision desk or looking at the data with them. Not just Fox, I believe the Associated Press as well made the Arizona projection. It was never for us. We asked that same question when we saw the call. What are they seeing? What are they seeing that we are not seeing? It worked out at the end for them, but I think anyone looking at the final vote totals in Arizona, 11,000 votes, is that? I don't remember what the final margin was in Arizona, but
11,000.
it was nowhere near in the range of being a projectable race from a decision desk point of view. So while the call ended up being correct in hindsight, it really clearly, I think the final margin showed it wasn't a truly projectable race. And we didn't see it. I do not envy being in the position of sweating that out as the vote totals were coming in.
Bill.
This is a good chance to talk about 2020 because it's another point of all the reasons that made 2020 difficult. We had something like 36 states change their election laws. California added to, we had 11 states mail live ballots. We were running, a lot of all these models, all this stuff we do are based on past experience. When you don't have past experience and you have all new election laws, the modeling is really very difficult. And in Arizona, which is a state I know incredibly well, having done McCain and Governor Ducey, Governor Symington, but this is another thing that happened, which is early mail votes were just way Democrat. People who came to vote early broke Republican, and election day voters were Republican by 30 points. And so what you needed to know in Arizona was the presumption that the mix of those votes would be like the rest of the state was maybe problematic because you don't know exactly what the mix is of election day voters. Mm-hmm. And election day voters in Arizona were voting for Trump by like 30 points. I agreed. I did my NBC thing 2 days later was I agreed that, it was good not to make a call. I felt like Trump was a little bit short, but I also said, having worked in this state a long time, it's not 90,000 votes. This is going to get very close. But on the other hand, I don't think an Arizona call had any zero Zippo bearing on anything that happened in this election or who voted. And after that, I think all that shit's just ridiculous.
It irritated a few people, but yes. Adam Zabner, an IOP student, asks, are you worried that horse race coverage of campaigns contributes to the phenomenon of political hobbyism where many partisans spend hours daily consuming media and polls? And I confess I got carpal tunnel disease refreshing my Real Clear Politics aggregate poll site, but don't do much to engage with their elected officials or help their side win. Dan, why don't you tackle that?
Well, that's a question that's probably as better put to individual citizens as to how they want to dip into an election and how obsessive they want to be about numbers. I remember back in 2008, being in Ohio one day and talking to some people who were organizing for your candidate at the time, Barack Obama, and the nervousness and how they were saying I go to Nate Silver 5 times a day to reassure myself that Barack Obama can win. The fact that there is all of that information means that people who are politically engaged, and certainly that's not the entirety of the country, but they are able to drown themselves in data and become amateur analysts about it. Does that change our coverage? I don't think so, but I think we have to recognize that we are collectively feeding that appetite, and that's not necessarily the healthiest thing for the state of democracy.
Michaelo Cabbage, I believe, from Oregon School-Based Health Alliance. Oftentimes journalists and publications seem more interested in a conflict-driven narrative than a mundane based reporting approach. Examples include giving a lot of coverage to dubious polls and overrepresenting a candidate gaffes. Is there a contradiction between the market interests that drive journalism and the accuracy that polling strives for? David Chalian.
Karl Rove used to say this back when he was in the White House and in the 2000 campaign too. I do think there is more so than a partisan bias that may exist. I do think there is a controversy bias in reporting, and I think too much of our political coverage is through that frame of trying to that controversy equals news somehow. Because it's controversial, it's newsworthy. I don't think that's always the case, but I do think we collectively, I'm speaking now, gravitate towards that. And also, I'm not sure, to Dan's earlier point, that is the healthiest thing for the larger small d democratic goals of our society and a participatory democracy. But I think that I can point to I could take the rest of the time on this panel and beyond to point to all the kinds of reporting that gets done that's not about that at all. So I by no means am suggesting that is where the totality of political reporting is, but I think the questioner raises an important thing, and I think it's something for us to be conscious of as we are producing these stories, to not always necessarily gravitate to thinking that controversy means it's a story we must do.
Yeah, it also speaks to the value of polling that transcends those top line numbers and the richer information that you can elicit from it. I'm going to combine these last two questions in the interest of time. Kevin Tsao from Eno Brands and Grant Wiles from the DCCC. On the previous panel, there was a suggestion that there needs to establish a baseline standards set for major media outlets when they report on polls in an effort to weed out polls that aren't up to par. Is that feasible? And a related question, why isn't it standard practice for pollsters to disclose specific weighting methodology when it has such a large impact on the results and is inherently subjective? Claudia, why don't you start there?
Sure. So I think that, there's one plus we have going for us, which is that the industry, especially over the past 20 or so years, has made a big move toward transparency. A lot of folks, a lot of pollsters in the government, outside public pollsters, belong to this organization called APOR, probably lots of people on this call. It's the American Association of Public Opinion Research. And they've had a big transparency initiative where they'll literally give you a seal of approval as a pollster if you reveal various things about your sampling and weighting. And, some of the aggregators use this, whether or not you have this seal of transparency approval, as an indication of quality. So I think we are moving towards that, at least among the big shops. I would ask maybe others to weigh in on what's going on with some of the smaller, maybe partisan shops.
Well, this is another feeling. I have strong feelings about when I joined NBC, Wall Street Journal in 2004, I said, I have one quote demand. Demand's too harsh. I wanted to do the work and was thrilled to be asked. But I said, it's very important to me that we disclose every demographic we ask, both so everybody can judge our demographics. So you can read our poll, you can look at every demographic question, you can see what the weights are across every demographic. We have a weighting document so you know what attributes we've weighted. There are some, including people on this panel, that don't yet show every demographic. I think that's a terrible mistake. It's easily correctable. But here's when we talk about a miss, or we talk about is if you look at the two exit polls, AP Votecast and the media exit poll, both of them say that self-described voters say that in 2016 they voted for Trump over Clinton by 3 points. This is another reality that I've got to tell you, that nowhere in NBC Wall Street Journal were we getting data that said that the likely voter pool of 2020 was a +3 Trump vote from 16. Had we done that, had we found it, had we put it in a poll, I can tell you they would have been roasted alive, because, but But that is a way where the actual electorate, I think, was clearly different than all of the, if the exit polls, both of the exit polls are right, then what we've been looking at. But it's one more reason why, as a consumer, it ought to be that every single question that gets asked in the survey, including every single demo and in what order it was asked, must be released. And I think as a public poll, that is the minimum standard. And to the gentleman's point, most of the polls that are on this panel do it, but they explain their weighting. Lots of them, and Pew does this, they show their unweighted and weighted data. They take the lead in that. But I think I think they're totally right to have that be a demand for anybody to release this public polling.
Claudia, talk about this issue of modeling. And, one thing that polls don't do particularly well is, beyond sort of gross measures of interest, predict kind of asymmetric turnout or unusual turnout. How big a problem is that for any polling, but particularly public polling? Because we saw in this election, for the second successive time, Trump turned out that sort of missed detection until Election Day.
Yeah, there's a couple things going on here. So for folks listening in who aren't familiar with the term modeling, what we're just saying is, because we know when we do a survey and we're trying to get a representative sample, we may not represent each group in the appropriate proportions. All of us now, best practice is to weight your data. And when you have federal numbers to weight to, like for age and race and gender, you can do that, and that makes it easy. You can get the right numbers. Our challenge is we don't have federal strong data on things like party ID, and so that makes it difficult. The modeling portion that was really a challenge in 2016, and maybe the silver lining of having had a polling miss, was when we went back and had that group dissect what had happened. We learned something really important, which is that prior to 2016, we found that people at different levels of the educational spectrum, they weren't voting necessarily for one party or another in a different way. And so for that reason, people weren't adjusting on education. Okay, we learned something about Donald Trump and his coalition. Now we find that education does correlate with vote. And so now when we wait, we have to add that to the mix. And so the challenge with 2020 is we did that, right? Now that we know that more educated voters are more likely to vote Democratic, which is a new trend in American politics for the moment, we can do that. We just don't know what other weighting we missed for 2020. Maybe something else happened. So to some extent, we're all trying to catch up.
One thing that John Anzalone said in the last session was that even with this division, that there are non-college voters who are salaried employees and work in some kinds of jobs that are predictive of one kind of vote. And there are non-college voters who work with their hands or do other things. And those voters were harder to detect. He also made the case that the virus itself, which kept some people home and other people going out, produced a difficulty in getting a representative sample because the people at home were more likely to answer. Let me just take the remaining time to ask you guys to just each of you say one thing that you've learned from 2020 that you would do differently moving forward. What one lesson that you've derived from the 2020 election? Dan, why don't I start with you?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that we just still are unable to figure out how to poll that Trump loyalist base in a way that gives us a sense of how many of them are going to come out and vote. I mean, it is a question that we asked continuously through the course of the year, which is, are we missing a part of the electorate that's going to, if not deliver the election for Trump, make this a very, very close race? I mean, in our after action analysis, David, in the state polling, what we found was that we underestimated the Trump number, and in particularly in the northern states where we polled, less so in the Floridas, North Carolinas, Arizonas, but in those northern states, we did not pick up what was a surge of election day voters for Donald Trump. And I think that is still, to me, a great challenge. Now, maybe it's simply because Donald Trump was on the ballot and we will not face that issue in the future. But I don't think we can take any, solace in that. There's a part of the electorate that we're still missing in our polling, and we've got to figure out how to find them.
David Chalian.
And they're across different demographic groups, right? I mean, that's the other thing. It's like seniors is a perfect example. We saw in all the pre-election polling this like huge Biden advantage for seniors that didn't materialize on election day or when the election totals were there. And so you even have to look at some of these groups and figure out which portions of them we're still missing. So I fully agree with Dan. The lesson is about capturing those voters that we seem to be missing in the polling. But I would just also add to that, which is I am extraordinarily focused on the way we report on polls and communicate about polls. And I think yet again, what 2020 teaches us is we have to bring our readers and audience along as much as we can, avoiding shorthanding, avoiding quick and simple this person's +4, like that means anything. Get into what the poll is telling us, but we really have to be better about what the poll can actually inform us about and what it can't. And one of the things that it doesn't do as well, which is not its gear thing, is to actually like predict an outcome. And so I just think we have to, as storytellers, and the way we incorporate our polling, be much more fulsome with the audience in bringing them along of what it is we can glean from this, and perhaps just as importantly, what it is we can't.
Claudia and Bill, we just have a few minutes left here before we have to go, but real quick, your biggest takeaway? Claudia?
Well, we're going to look at voter files and compare who did vote compared to who we said would vote. That's an important correction. But the most important thing we're going to do is we're going to expand methodology so that in addition to cells and landline, we're going to add text and email to web. And we're going to substantially, bunch up our cell sizes so that by expanding methodology and dramatically increasing cell size, we try to be as inclusive as we can to have a deep a profile as we can of the electorate.
Claudia, you're muted.
We'll be doing our Pew thing. We'll have a couple reports coming out on what we know about verified voters and who actually voted, what the potential undersampling of Trump voters means for issue polls, and a couple of other really geeky methods things. So get on that listserv. Well, listen, I so appreciate all of you. This has been a very rich discussion, a lot of work to do moving forward. And I appreciate your participation. I urge everyone in 5 minutes after we end to join a conversation between Charlie Cook and Ann Seltzer, the pollster of the pollster who conducts the Iowa poll for the Des Moines Register. She did well this year, took a lot of grief when she came, from me in part, when she came out with a poll that showed Donald Trump winning by a substantial margin in Iowa. She turned out to be right on the numbers. Charlie's going to have a conversation with how she approached her state and see what lessons we can derive from that. And again, thank you to all of you, David Chalian, Dan Balz, Claudia Deane, and Bill McInturff, for shedding some light on this subject. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Take care.